Everyone here to Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Mike Rache. Always great to be with you, especially on a debate day as we get you ready for CNN's big presidential debate. Of course, it'll simulcast right here on Live Now from Fox, 9 p.m. Eastern. But before we get to the debate, of course, we got to talk about what to expect and some of the insights as well. My next guest here loves politics, has his own show as well as has politicians on. And we're going to talk to him right now. He is in Atlanta covering this presidential debate. Wyatt Sharpe, host of the Wyatt Sharpe Show. Thanks so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, Wyatt, first off, before we talk about the debate, let's just talk about you're 15 years old. You have a great love for politics. You're from Canada, but you even enjoy the politics here in the States. Tell us a little bit about why you're so into politics.
I think it's just based off of kind of a general kind of curiosity for what's happening in the world around me, whether it be over the course of the pandemic, for example, seeing various lawmakers and medical professionals kind of providing their opinions and their insights, and then, new questions kind of being sparked in my own mind. And then I started emailing some of these people. And then some of them, posed the idea of, well, perhaps we should have a Zoom conversation. And so then I decided to publish the conversations for people to kind of benefit from in the same way that I was benefiting from. And so it started with Canadian politics because, of course, that's where I'm from. And that's very much where it was easier at the time to get people to agree to come on. But it since has kind of extended to the U.S. just based off of, the sole fact that oftentimes what happens in the U.S. kind of has a trickle-down effect, so to speak, and ends up impacting Canadians just as much, if not more, as our own politics.
Yeah, so true. So well said. So, Wyatt, we are gearing up for tonight. Very excited to see these two candidates, President Joe Biden and President Trump. What do you expect tonight?
I think it's really interesting, especially when we're looking at both of these two candidates and kind of the respective, things in which they have to do over the course of tonight. For President Biden, that is, of course, explaining why the past 4 years has been good, or at least in his opinion, why it has been good for the American people. But he'll also have to overcome some of the arguments surrounding his cognitive decline, as we know former President Trump is very much likely to bring up tonight. And then for former President Trump, he really is able to just say, look at what's been happening over the course of the last 4 years. The cost of living is higher. We really haven't made a lot of progress. He can look at and, say the fact that the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel was really accelerated under this administration. And so he actually, I would argue, has kind of the upper hand going into tonight's debate just because he doesn't have to necessarily defend a record. Now, of course, it's a little bit different because he still has a record given that he was president beforehand, but it's, of course, not as relevant in the minds of the American people, given that it was, 4 years ago now.
Yeah, so true. And speaking about 4 years ago, we saw these two debate. And what we saw a lot of the times was Donald Trump really trying to be loud and overpowering Joe Biden, cutting him off at times. And really, at times it was very distracting. Now it's going to be a different mode here because of the way that this debate is set up with the microphones that will be cut off when the candidate is not supposed to be speaking. And do you think that could actually benefit Donald Trump where it will have, let Joe Biden speak more?
I think to a certain degree, perhaps, but I do think that if we look back at the 2020 debates, former President Trump often enjoyed making his own kind of respective arguments in the form of rebuttals to what President Biden was saying. And oftentimes that included interruptions, whereas President Biden, well, at times he still did do that. He generally tried to stick a little bit more within the allotted time windows that the Commission on Presidential Debates in 2020 had provided. So I guess the real question here tonight that a lot of people are asking is, can Donald Trump remain kind of presidential, so to speak, and adhere to these time limits while still expressing his points that he wants to express in an effective way? And I mean, I think if he's able to do that, then it'll be kind of, good to say that he's had kind of a safe night, so to speak, or at least a night that will not harm him moving forward into this campaign. Because, of course, this debate is much earlier than some of the previous debates. It's the earliest debate ever. It's before both of the conventions, which a lot of people are arguing it's because that way, if either one of these two candidates perhaps screws up something tonight or does something that, makes them get some bad publicity, it won't be as relevant in the minds of Americans come November 5th.
And who do you think tonight has more pressure on them, Biden or Trump?
It's interesting because I think that at least the polls suggest that the vast majority of Americans don't really want either one of these two people to be president, and yet somehow here we are. I think it really isn't so much that one person has more to prove, but I do think that President Biden, given the fact that the Trump campaign really goes after him over his cognitive decline, really as one of the main points on their campaign, in order for him to kind of put that to bed, he actually has to have a fairly positive night tonight. I mean, you saw, for example, whether it be the Juneteenth event at the White House, the Jimmy Kimmel fundraiser with President Barack Obama, the Republicans were really criticizing him for having some, struggles with his cognitive state during those events. And so, again, if he has a good night tonight, hopefully that'll help him put some of these criticisms that Republicans are making to bed.
Yeah, so true. And you also take a look at what could possibly be up next for President Trump with his legal battles as well at the
Yeah.
helm. So, of course, those will be some questions spread throughout this debate as well.
Oh, 100%. And I mean, if we're looking at the legal troubles, of course, there's one conviction. His sentencing is on July 11th, just days before the Republican National Convention. And so, it's interesting to think about that, just given based purely off of kind of a political standpoint, that a lot of Americans are tuned into it. They're seeing the fact that this conviction has happened, and they're wondering how it's going to kind of play into the American political state. Whether or not it's going to be brought up tonight is actually an interesting question, because generally we've seen the Biden campaign and President Biden himself shy away from actually bringing it up, just based off of the nature that Donald Trump is actually benefiting in some ways from this, because we've seen his poll numbers increase. So by the Biden campaign bringing it up, perhaps his poll numbers would only increase even further. So it definitely is interesting to think about. And I mean, if Donald Trump continues with some of the same messaging tonight that he has been for a long time, which is, the justice system is being weaponized against him, certainly he's going to be able to enthusiase his base. But the real question is, will that be enough to persuade people who are currently supporting President Biden, but also independents, because about 10% of Americans right now don't know who to support? Will that be enough to bring them over to his campaign? A lot of the strategists that I've been talking to think that, he'll have some troubles with that.
And Wyatt, what about, there was some talking, and there's even talking still right now of what kind of President Biden will we see tonight? Will we see the State of the Union, President Biden, or will we see more of what we see sometimes during and after events that he does at the White House or on the road? What do you think we will see?
It's interesting because, of course, President Biden, when I've interviewed mental health experts, neurologists as an example, I mean, they talk about President Biden and some of his cognitive troubles, and they make reference to the fact that it is very much the same type of kind of mental decline that you would expect for someone of President Biden's age, someone who's 81 years old. And so, regardless of how he performs tonight, it's not to say that there's something wrong, with his cognitive state, but certainly the majority of Americans who are watching this debate, if it's clear that there is some issues there, they could make some strong judgments after tonight that could have a negative impact on his campaign, which kind of brings me back to the first point that I made originally, that this debate is being held so early on in the cycle that I would think that Joe Biden and his team are probably thinking that it's a good thing. That way, if something goes bad tonight, they'll be able to kind of move past it, given that they still have the convention to go through. They have months of campaigning to go through before we even think about coming close to the November general election.